Caroline Leavitt stepped into the arena with an unwavering confidence that set the tone for what was about to unfold. From the moment she opened her mouth, it was clear she wasn't there to simply be a passive participant in the conversation. Her presence was commanding, and her words were poised with the kind of assurance that could shift any interaction in an instant. She wasn't concerned about fitting into the expectations of others or playing by traditional rules. Instead, she was there to establish herself as a force in the room, and she did so with remarkable precision. What set her apart in that moment was her ability to effortlessly control the flow of the conversation. She wasn't just answering questions or reacting to statements. She was leading the exchange, steering it with a sense of purpose that left little room for anyone to challenge her authority. It was as if she had mastered the art of not just speaking, but commanding the attention of everyone around her. Her words came fast, deliberate, and with the kind of clarity that made it nearly impossible for anyone to disregard what she was saying. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just a clear, direct line of thought that carried her forward. Her tone, which had the perfect balance of firmness and engagement, didn't just convey confidence, it demanded respect. She was keenly aware of the dynamics in the room and the audience at large. Each word she spoke was calculated to maximize impact, not just to present her ideas, but to challenge, push, and provoke. And in doing so, she expertly put herself in a position of strength. She wasn't just another voice in the crowd. She was a voice that carried weight. This is where her true power lied, not just in what she said, but in how she said it. It wasn't about simply being loud or aggressive. Instead, it was about choosing her moments and knowing exactly when to assert herself. She didn't have to dominate with volume. Her confidence was in the control she exhibited over the conversations. Direction. Every pause she took, every carefully measured response, added to the authority she was building. The audience, both in the studio and at home, could sense it. They were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses to something unfolding in real time, something that had the potential to upend the entire rhythm of the exchange. As the conversation evolved, she displayed an uncanny ability to read the situation and adapt accordingly. There was an inherent understanding of the subtle nuances of communication. She knew when to lean in, when to pull back, and when to escalate the stakes of the discussion. It was a masterful display of strategic communication, one where the subtlety of her delivery was just as powerful as the content of her words. She was a verbal tactician, using every phrase and gesture to reinforce her dominance in the conversation. In doing so, she made it clear that she was no mere guest. She was a participant on equal footing, if not with more authority. She didn't come to merely entertain or follow the script that was expected of her. No, she came to challenge the status quo, to present a perspective that was sharp, uncompromising, and deeply insightful. Her message was clear. She wasn't just there to be talked over or around. She was there to be heard and to have her voice take up space in the narrative. The intensity of her presence seemed to alter the atmosphere in the room. What began as a typical exchange quickly shifted into a dynamic where her words took center stage. It was as though the focus of the conversation was no longer just about what was being discussed, but how she was presenting herself in relation to the conversation itself. She became not just a speaker, but the embodiment of confidence, a person who knew exactly how to manipulate the dynamics of any interaction to her advantage. Her ability to engage and hold the audience's attention spoke volumes about her command of the moment. There was an unmistakable energy that came from her words, one that carried the kind of weight that often only the most seasoned communicators can achieve. It was as if she had the ability to make even the most complex points feel accessible and urgent, each one building on the last until the conversation was no longer just a back and forth, but a controlled narrative that she was sculpting with every exchange. And in that space, she became more than just an interviewee or a guest. She became a force, someone who had the power to shape not just the conversation, but the very perception of the moment itself. As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that the dynamics of the conversation were rapidly shifting. The person who had been at the center of the conversation, someone well known for their sharp wit and control of the environment, found themselves increasingly off balance. The carefully constructed facade of effortless confidence that they often projected began to crack under the pressure of the interaction. This was a pivotal moment, one that revealed just how powerful the presence of a determined, assertive voice could be in redirecting the flow of a conversation. What was most striking was the visible change in the person's demeanor as the conversation progressed. They, who were typically in control, suddenly seemed to struggle with the very rhythm of the exchange. This wasn't merely a slip in their composure, it was the unraveling of a carefully maintained air of invincibility. Every attempt to steer the conversation back to their comfort zone was met with a resistance they hadn't anticipated. For the first time, they were on the defensive, and this shift was palpable. What stood out was how this individual's usual arsenal of humor and quick wit failed to land with the same impact they were accustomed to. The sharp retorts, which usually disarmed and controlled the flow of conversation, began to feel hollow and ineffective in the face of the challenge they were encountering. The more they tried to regain their footing, the more they seemed to lose ground. The inability to dominate the narrative was a rare and unexpected experience for someone used to commanding a room with ease. It was almost as though the very tools they relied on, humor, timing, and sarcasm, had been rendered powerless by the unexpected force of the conversation. The shift in power was evident not just in the words exchanged, but in the body language, too. This person, who typically exuded an air of control, began to visibly tense up. Small, subtle shifts, such as avoiding eye contact, pausing before speaking, or shifting uncomfortably in their seat, revealed a sense of vulnerability that had not been present before. It was a fascinating contrast to the person's usual self-assured, poised demeanor. These were not signs of someone merely caught off guard. These were the signs of someone grappling with the realization that they had lost control of the moment, in a very real way. The discomfort wasn't just internal, it translated to the environment around them. There was a palpable tension in the air, an almost electric charge that seemed to reverberate throughout the room. It was as if the audience, too, could feel the shift in power dynamics and were collectively holding their breath, awaiting how the individual would respond. This wasn't just about a verbal exchange, it had become an internal battle for control, with every passing second amplifying the pressure. The very foundation of the conversation, which had once seemed so steady and predictable, was now in flux. What was particularly striking was the contrast in how the conversation began and how it had evolved. At the outset, this person had been able to dictate the tone, establish the boundaries, and guide the narrative in a way that made them the unquestioned center of attention. They were used to being the one who set the terms of the engagement, who defined the pace and direction of the dialogue. But now, the table had been turned, and it was clear that they were no longer the one controlling the narrative. Their efforts to regain that control were met with frustration, and the more they attempted to redirect, the more it seemed like the moment was slipping away from them. Each attempt they made to reclaim dominance over the exchange only served to highlight the growing gap in control. The words they spoke, while still laced with the sharp wit they were known for, now felt less effective, as though the audience had begun to see through the performance. The jokes, the sarcastic comments, the well-timed retorts, none of it seemed to have the same impact it once did. What had once been their greatest strength was now their greatest weakness, as the pressure to regain control mounted and their usual defenses crumbled. The real turning point came when it became clear that this individual wasn't simply grappling with the content of the conversation, but with the fact that they could not outmaneuver the challenge that had been presented to them. They were now faced with a reality they hadn't anticipated. Their usual strategies were ineffective, and they were, in a sense, powerless to regain the upper hand. The moment was a stark reminder that even the most skilled individuals can find themselves caught off guard, their usual tactics no longer sufficient in the face of unexpected forces. What had once been an easy back and forth had transformed into a scenario where they were fighting to regain the upper hand, with each attempt serving only to remind them of the shifting power dynamics. The struggle was clear. No longer was this a simple conversation, but a battle for control. And, in this battle, the stakes were higher than just winning the moment. They were about maintaining the position they had always held with ease. The encounter took an unexpected turn when one participant, with a seemingly effortless precision, shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. It was not just a typical exchange of ideas, but a calculated act of dismantling an established presence. With each carefully chosen word, this individual strategically chipped away at the prevailing image that had dominated the room, effectively putting the other at a distinct disadvantage. What was most striking was not merely the content of what was being said, but the way in which the message was delivered. Each phrase an arrow aimed at the heart of an unspoken hierarchy that had long governed the flow of such interactions. The brilliance of this moment lay in its subtlety. There was no loud, dramatic confrontation or overt challenge, no flashy outburst to grab attention. Instead, the power of the words came from a quiet, calculated dissection of the other person's persona, each remark inching closer to a revelation that others had long avoided acknowledging. This individual didn't need to shout to be heard. The effect of their words was far more profound, because it was not an attempt to match the usual bravado, but to simply pull the rug out from under it. By questioning the carefully constructed image that had been so firmly established, they managed to flip the situation on its head, leaving the other participants scrambling to maintain their footing. What was particularly remarkable was the way in which the commentary cut through the superficial layers of the conversation, bypassing the usual defenses. It wasn't about attacking the substance of the arguments or even the points being made. Instead, it was an attack on the framework itself, on the ease with which the other had been allowed to exist within a controlled narrative. The moment was a reminder that power in such exchanges doesn't just lie in what one argues, but in how one chooses to engage with the established norms and expectations of the setting. This individual understood that to truly humiliate wasn't simply to argue louder or more forcefully, but to subtly, yet undeniably, challenge the assumptions that had long been taken for granted. Each of their words was delivered with the intent to expose a vulnerability that had gone unnoticed before. The sense of discomfort that began to spread in the room was not just the result of a sharp retort, but of a deeper realization that the carefully maintained facade of invincibility had been pierced. The participant, who had always been seen as the one in control, now found themselves confronted with an unsettling truth. Their position was not as secure as they had believed. With every statement made by the challenger, the cracks in their carefully crafted image became more evident, and the weight of their own vulnerability became harder to deny. There was a strategic brilliance in the timing as well. The remarks, though seemingly casual, were aimed with surgical precision, each one landing at a moment when the other had no choice but to absorb the blow. This wasn't about forcing an immediate reaction, it was about planting a seed of doubt that would take root and grow as the conversation continued. The subtlety of the attack made it all the more devastating because it wasn't something that could easily be countered or dismissed. The force of the challenge wasn't in the volume of words, but in their undeniable clarity and the uncomfortable truth they carried with. At no point did this individual try to overwhelm the other with a barrage of criticisms. Instead, they focused on a few key areas, each one delicately nudging the conversation into a territory where the other had no option but to acknowledge their own weaknesses. The effect of this approach was compounded by the quiet intensity that accompanied the words. There was no need for drama or loud confrontation. The power of the moment came from its quiet efficiency, the way each remark built upon the last, pushing the other to the brink of recognition without offering them a clear way to escape. This wasn't a battle of ideas, it was a battle for status, for the dominance of one voice over another. And by challenging the very assumptions that underpinned the prevailing narrative, this individual shifted the balance of power without ever raising their voice in anger or resorting to sensationalism. It was, in many ways, a masterclass in how to strip away the trappings of authority and reduce them to something more vulnerable and raw. In doing so, they didn't just make a point, they made it impossible for the other to continue pretending they were the undisputed authority in the room. As the conversation continued, the effects of this carefully executed dismantling became more and more apparent. The other participant, once the center of attention, now found themselves on the back foot, unable to regain the same foothold they had enjoyed before. The discomfort that had begun as a subtle shift was now a palpable force, as they struggled, to reassert themselves in the face of a challenge that had exposed a fundamental weakness they could no longer ignore. What had started as a simple exchange had transformed into a moment of reckoning, where the cost of maintaining a particular persona became glaringly clear. And it was in that realization that the true power of the challenge lay, not in the directness of the attack, but in the quiet, unyielding force of a well-placed remark that could bring down even the most formidable of figures. The aftermath of the exchange was filled with a palpable sense of discomfort. What had initially seemed like a standard scripted conversation quickly morphed into something much more unpredictable. The participant who had been caught off guard was now visibly struggling to regain control. Their every attempt to steer the conversation back to familiar territory met with growing frustration. It was clear that the carefully cultivated confidence they had relied on for years was no longer sufficient to navigate this unexpected shift in dynamics. What followed was a prolonged period of uncertainty, where each attempt at regaining authority only seemed to compound the pressure they were under. For a person so accustomed to controlling the pace of any conversation, this was an unfamiliar experience. The person had always been known for their quick wit and ability to command attention with ease. They had mastered the art of using humor, charm, and sharp retorts to guide interactions, leaving little room for others to challenge their authority. But now, in the face of this unexpected shift, those tools seemed ineffective. Their usual responses, once so effortlessly deployed, now felt forced and weak, as though they were struggling to regain the rhythm of a conversation that had already moved beyond their control. The effort to recover wasn't just verbal, it was physical as well. There was an unmistakable shift in body language, a subtle but telling change in posture and expression. Once confident and poised, the participant now appeared increasingly uneasy. Small gestures, like shifting in their seat or clearing their throat, betrayed the internal struggle they were experiencing. Their face, usually a mask of composure, now flickered with moments of frustration and confusion. These were not the signs of someone who had simply been caught off guard for a moment, but of someone realizing that they were not in control of the situation as they had always been. As the tension in the room mounted, so did the person's attempts to regain the upper hand. They resorted to humor, making jokes in an attempt to reassert their dominance, but the jokes felt hollow, lacking the sharpness and impact they once had. There was an awkwardness to the attempts, as if they were desperately trying to reach for the familiar comfort of their usual tactics. But with every attempt, the gap between their intended authority and the reality of the situation grew wider. It was no longer just a matter of trying to steer the conversation back on track. It had become a battle to maintain an image, one that was beginning to crack under the weight of the moment. The growing frustration was not only evident in the physical signs of discomfort, but also in the tone of their voice. Where once there had been a certain lightness and ease in their delivery, there was now an edge, an impatience that was hard to disguise. Each time they attempted to take control, it felt like a forceful reassertion of authority that only highlighted their inability to maintain the dominance they had once held so effortlessly. The audience, whether present in the room or watching from afar, could feel the shift. What had once been a one-sided interaction had become an uneven exchange, with the other participant now occupying a position of strength that was undeniably hard to ignore. The tension was further amplified by the person's growing inability to engage in the conversation on their own terms. They found themselves responding to rather than leading the exchange, caught in a cycle where every reaction seemed to further highlight their loss of power. It was as if they were locked in a pattern of trying to catch up to a conversation that was moving too quickly for them to control. Each new attempt to recover felt more desperate, more transparent, as though they were trying to reclaim ground that had already been lost. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was the realization that, despite all their efforts, they were failing to regain their footing. The usual methods they would have used to reclaim control, cutting remarks, sharp humor, or clever deflection, were no longer working. Instead, they found themselves at a loss, unable to regain the same sharp edge that had once made them so formidable. There was no way to hide the fact that the balance of power had shifted irreparably. As the minutes ticked by, it became clearer that this was not just a momentary lapse or a minor setback. This was a fundamental shift in the dynamic of the exchange, one that could not be easily undone. The person was no longer in charge of the conversation, and no amount of quick thinking or humor was going to change that. The realization was uncomfortable for both them and the audience. The masks had fallen away, revealing the vulnerability that lay beneath. And with that vulnerability came a growing sense of frustration, not just at the loss of control, but at the helplessness that accompanied it. This wasn't just a matter of losing a conversation. It was about losing a sense of self-assuredness, the very thing that had made them so successful in the past. The longer they struggled to reclaim control, the more the audience saw the cracks in the armor. There was no easy way out of this moment. The struggle to regain control was now more than just about the conversation. It was about holding on to the persona they had so carefully cultivated, and it was clear that no amount of effort could restore what had been lost. In the end, what unfolded was more than just an exchange of words. It was a moment of profound vulnerability. For someone who had been accustomed to dominating every conversation, to being the center of attention and the one with the power to steer any narrative, the sudden loss of control was a humbling experience. This wasn't just a slip-up in the usual flow of dialogue. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power that rattled the very foundation of the conversation. The true weight of the moment wasn't in the failure to regain control, but in the realization that power is fragile and easily disrupted. The carefully built persona of invincibility began to crumble under the pressure of the challenge. What had once been a fortress of confidence and authority now seemed like a facade that, in the face of unexpected resistance, could not withstand the strain. And in that moment, the individual was left with a stark truth. No one, no matter how skilled or accustomed to power, is immune to being unsettled. The interaction revealed the underlying fragility of the control that had been so firmly held. It's often said that in any exchange, the true measure of strength isn't about dominating the conversation or maintaining authority at all costs, but in how one handles the moments when control slips away. This was one such moment where instead of crumbling under the pressure, it could have been an opportunity to recalibrate, to engage with the challenge in a way that didn't rely on the usual tactics. Yet, the struggle to recover highlighted the difficulty of letting go of the image of invulnerability, of admitting that sometimes power is not about being the loudest or the sharpest in the room, but about the ability to adapt and respond when things don't go as planned. The audience, too, became participants in this unraveling. Watching this person, once so firmly planted at the center of the conversation, now falter and flounder, was a reminder that even the most established figures are susceptible to change. There's an odd form of respect that emerges in such moments. One that doesn't come from the display of control, but from the rawness of the experience. The tension, the struggle, and the discomfort all became part of the narrative, and in a strange way, it humanized the situation in a way that might not have been possible had the exchange gone according to plan. Ultimately, this wasn't just about who won the conversation or who regained control. It was about the transformation that happens when the expected roles are reversed and the very structure of the interaction is altered. It was about the realization that the struggle for dominance is often less important than the humility that can come from losing it. In the end, it wasn't just the shift in power that was most significant, but the opportunity for everyone involved, including the audience, to reflect on the impermanence of control and how it can change in an instant.